Hello, welcome to Canon Law in Exile. When we last got together, which was on March 13th, we had gotten about a quarter of the way through Lesson 6 on Penal Law. So we will pick up where we left off back then, 10 days ago. The last thing we talked about was the difference between latae sententiae and ferende sententiae penalties. You'll remember that latae sententiae penalties often are described as being automatic. That means you incur the penalty simply by committing the crime, simply by doing the prohibited deed, you incur the penalty. Ferende sententiae is different. That means that the penalty is imposed only after a judicial process, essentially a trial, or a quicker type of procedure called an administrative procedure. Note that we say that a ferende sententiae penalty is imposed. If you hear the word imposed, you should automatically think ferende sententiae. By contrast, if you hear the word declared, that means we're talking about a latae sententiae penalty. And the words make sense. Imposed means it's imposed by the trial, imposed by the administrative procedure, whereas a latae sententiae penalty that's being declared, the authority, the judge or the ordinary, is simply declaring that this penalty has in fact been incurred. For example, let's say you physically attack the Pope. Now, the penalty for that is a latae sententiae excommunication. And Canon 1331 tells us that some effects are going to follow immediately. And then, if the penalty later is declared, not just incurred, but actually declared, then some additional effects will follow. We're going to talk about those when we get to excommunication in just a minute, so I won't say what they are now, but just keep in mind what's the difference between declared and undeclared. Additional consequences are going to follow with the declaration. Okay. Keep in mind, though, when we talk about latae sententiae and ferende sententiae, these two terms are not penalties themselves. Rather, they are ways that penalties are incurred. So you don't just say usually this is latae sententiae. You say this is a latae sententiae excommunication or interdict. Let me give you an example. So the same penalty in some instances might be latae sententiae, and in other instances ferende sententiae. Let's take the penalty of interdict, and again, in just a minute, we'll discuss what interdict entails, but you've heard of it. You know it's a penalty. Interdict can be latae sententiae for a physical attack on a bishop. We just talked about a physical attack on the Pope that has a latae sententiae excommunication. Physical attack on a bishop is a little bit less, a latae sententiae interdict. But interdict can also, for a different crime, say simony, the crime is also interdict, but it's ferende sententiae. It has to be imposed by a judicial process or an administrative procedure. So just keep in mind, latae sententiae and ferende sententiae, not penalties in themselves, but ways that penalties come into existence. Okay, now if you're following along in Woodall, we're kind of in the late 460s, early 470s. We're about to discuss types of penal sanctions, and this is Woodall, page 470, if you want to follow along. There are two main categories of penalties. One is called expiatory penalty, and the other is called a censure. There are two main categories, and they're different. They're different types of penalties. So we'll discuss both of them. Let's start with expiatory penalties. Here's how to, in a way, tell the difference between these two things, expiatory penalties and censures. If you think of the purpose of inflicting a penalty, there were a couple of different purposes, possible purposes. One is to punish the person. Um, one might be to repair scandal, and one might be to correct injustice. Put those three ideas kind of in one basket. And then in a different basket, think of another possibility. Maybe we'd call it rehabilitation or calling back the offender. These two types of purposes are the reason we have these two types of penalties. When we're talking about an expiatory penalty, we're thinking of the purpose to punish the offender, to repair scandal, and to correct injustice. That's what primarily an expiatory penalty is aimed at. By contrast, as we'll see in a minute, when we're talking about a censure, the purpose there is to call back the offender. It's called a censure is a very serious penalty, but it's called a medicinal penalty. The main purpose is to call back the offender. So those are going to be our main differences. Okay, continuing to talk about expiatory penalties. They can be temporary or permanent, and let me just give you a couple of examples of what some expiatory penalties might be. And you can find these around Canons 1336, also 1338. One might be a prohibition on residence in a certain place. You've caused a problem in a place, we're going to prohibit you from residing there, maybe temporarily, maybe permanently. Another expiatory penalty, deprivation of office. We may take your office away. You're a pastor. We're gonna take that away from you. Um, most seriously, the most serious expiatory penalty and the most important to us is dismissal from the clerical state. So this is going to be a cleric being removed from the clerical state and returned to the lay state, in a sense, forcibly, because of a penal process. And this is, you've I'm sure all heard, this has become quite a common penalty for the crime of sexual abuse of a minor. So it's achieved special importance in our time. Most of the time, an expiatory penalty is going to be imposed ferende sententiae, not latae sententiae. And if you want a reference on that, look at Canon 1336, Section 2. Okay, those are expiatory penalties on the one side. Again, the penalties intended primarily to punish, to repair scandal, to correct injustice. Now the censures. Now let's talk about censures. And these are the penalties intended to call people back, the medicinal penalties, to call back the erring offender. Canon 1312 is where we get the idea of medicinal penalties. There are three types of censures. Three specific, or we could say there are just three censures. One censure, we'll put a list up here. One censure is excommunication. That's the most serious one. Then interdict, and then suspension. These are our three censures. If you hear about a censure, sometimes the law will say, well, this is going to be punished by a censure. So it's not telling us which censure it will be, but it has to be one of the three. Okay. Let's see. Let's start at the top, talk about the most serious, excommunication. What does excommunication entail? We'll look at Canon 1331, Section 1, and you'll see. This is also a good place to talk about the difference between an undeclared latae sententiae penalty, or an undeclared latae sententiae excommunication, and a declared latae sententiae excommunication. Now, excommunication itself, again, it could be latae sententiae, could be ferende sententiae. Most of the time, it's latae sententiae. Um, the effects of excommunication are stated in Canon 1331, Section 1. Prohibition on celebrating the Eucharist or any other public worship. Also, you're forbidden to celebrate the sacraments, and you are forbidden to receive the sacraments. Also, you are forbidden to exercise any church office, and you're forbidden to exercise any act of governance, such as officiating at a wedding. Now, what happens if the uh, penalty, either if it's latae sententiae, and now it's not just incurred, but it's actually declared, or if it's ferende sententiae and it's imposed? So we either got a trial and we've decided that the penalty is going to be uh, excommunication, or we've simply got a declaration that this event occurred, and now we're going to actually declare that the excommunication was incurred. So once the penalty is imposed or declared, more consequences follow. We said above that the excommunicate is forbidden to exercise any act of governance. Once the penalty is declared or imposed, he what happens is that if he does exercise any act of governance, it's invalid. So think of officiating at a wedding. You were forbidden from officiating at the wedding just by um, having incurred a latae sententiae excommunication. But now, if that excommunication is declared, then your officiating at the wedding actually becomes invalid. That's going to be the main consequence of a declared versus undeclared latae sententiae excommunication. Okay, our second censure is interdict. So let's talk about interdict. Um, in the old days, that used to be a territorial concept. It meant that celebration of the sacraments was forbidden in a certain realm. That's not what interdict means anymore. Now, what it means is that you might think of the Eastern Code. In the Eastern Code, they don't have the penalty interdict, but they've got essentially the same thing, but they call it a lesser excommunication. And that's a really good name for it, because what's involved with a lesser excommunication or an interdict is, again, you're forbidden to celebrate the Eucharist or to participate in public worship, or to have a ministerial role in public worship. You're also forbidden to celebrate the sacraments and forbidden to receive the sacraments. Okay, that's interdict. Sounds a little bit like excommunication, doesn't it? Um, that's because uh, it, there really is that overlap. There are a lot of things in common between interdict and excommunication. What's the difference? Interdict does not necessarily affect your office or your acts of governance, while excommunication does. Interdict is going to affect your participation in worship, your celebration of the sacraments, your reception of the sacraments, just like excommunication. But unlike excommunication, it's not going to say that you can't commit any acts of governance, and it's not going to invalidate any acts of governance that you do undertake. That's going to be the main difference. So they're going to be not a whole lot of difference between the two. Interdict might be used when you want to use maybe a lesser penalty because you think the person might be more likely to respond. Interdict, in a sense, just doesn't sound quite as bad as excommunication. Okay, what's our third censure? Our third censure, of course, is suspension. And suspension is, you can find it in Canon 1333. Suspension affects only a member of the clergy. It's kind of interesting because suspension has a lot to do with offices that you hold. And as we know, laity can hold offices. So why aren't laity subject to suspension? Well, that's just the code we have now. We'll see if we have something different in the revision of Book 6 that we're expecting, but might be something that you think about. You might even think about it in connection with your thought piece that you're writing, though it probably wouldn't be a main focus, but it's at least might get you thinking about an issue of penal law. Suspension, as we say, affects only clergy, and what it does is it forbids the cleric from exercising some or all of the acts of orders. So it might forbid him from exercising his office, it might forbid him from exercising acts of governance or other acts of orders. It has to be specified in the penalty uh, what actually is being incurred. So with this one, while there are a lot of latae sententiae excommunications and latae sententiae interdicts, suspension usually is going to be ferende sententiae. Okay, we'll end this first video here. Next time, we'll have maybe a concluding remark by me on latae sententiae penalties, and then maybe a short description of how penalties are applied. Thank you very much, and we'll see you in the next video.